Today we continue talking about World War II. We're going to focus especially on what's called the home front, which means what was going on in the United States while the war was raging elsewhere. And then we'll also talk about the war in Europe from where we left off until it ended specifically in Europe. All right, so first let's talk about the home front. We talk about, like, for example, with the First World War, the Eastern Front, the Western Front. A front basically means where a war is fought. And the reason why the U.S. was called the home front, for Americans at least, is because a lot of Americans were contributing quite a bit to the war effort, even if they themselves were not doing the actual fighting. All right, so we're going to learn what was going on in America during the years of World War II. First off, the 1940 presidential election. This was FDR's third election, and this is why it's so significant. It's the first time an American president had ever been elected to a third term. Not only the first time, but the only time a president has ever served more than two terms, and 1940 was the year that happened. All right, so by the home front, we mean the United States during the war, right? The people who did not go off to Europe, who did not go off to the Pacific, but still helped out in a variety of ways with the war effort. And there are a lot of ways that people contributed, and we'll get to those right here. A lot of Americans worked in factories to make supplies, especially women. Since a good chunk of men left the country to fight in the war, their jobs in factories had to be filled by women who were not allowed to serve in combat positions. So they built supplies. Okay, you need a lot of workers to help make all the weapons and ammunition that you need for a world war. Another way that people helped out with the war effort was to ration their own food to make sure that the soldiers had enough. People also bought war bonds, which is basically a loan that you give to the government so that they can afford to wage war, and then you get paid back after the war is over. And then people would also, this might sound a little bit weird, but people would actually save things like bacon grease. And why they would save bacon grease and then give it to their butcher who would make sure it got to ammunition factories is because bacon grease has a lot of fat, and fats contain glycerin, which is used to make explosives. All right, so by saving bacon grease and donating that bacon grease and waste kitchen fats, giving that to the military, that helped make explosives, helped make bullets and torpedoes and things like that. Also, flat tires were saved and given to the military too for similar reasons. And of course, you have this poster right here. Of course, this is not a real poster. This is a poster from the movie Captain America. But this is one example of a type of poster that would be around. It says "Cap salutes you, buy war bonds." That is something that a lot of companies encouraged people to do, was to buy war bonds, because you have to have money to fight a war. And even companies like Disney would make cartoons that encouraged people to help out on the home front. We're going to watch one of those cartoons a little bit later in class. Now, the roles of women and minorities changed quite a bit on the home front during World War II. You have a lot of new economic opportunities, especially for women and minorities, really increasing at this time. Women began to work in non-traditional occupations, things like dangerous manual labor in factories, for example. Sometimes even working on battleships, just things that women technically would not, or traditionally would not do, because it was not seen as their role. But now they did, because no one else was there to do the work. Okay, all the men were off fighting. Okay, so women performed these duties that had historically been assigned to men, like factory jobs, working at naval air bases, things like that. And then you have this lady named Rosie the Riveter. This was one of the most famous, popular posters of the day. And these were everywhere. And you have this woman kind of flexing her bicep there that says, "We can do it." And this is associated with the changing role of women in American society during World War II, saying they can do anything, they can help out just as much as the men can, but just in different ways. Now, Dr. Seuss actually made a cartoon at this time that encouraged Americans to conserve natural resources, conserve oil, gasoline for the war effort. So not only did we ration our food, we also conserved gasoline and oil, all right, and you even had people like Dr. Seuss and Walt Disney getting in to the war effort to help people really do their part. That was a big, a different kind of mindset in America at the time was everyone has to do their part for us to win this war. So it was a time of a lot of selflessness in America, where people said, what is best for the country? What is best for the war effort? What can I do? More so than what can the government do for me, which is sometimes what you see today. There were also a lot of posters that warned American citizens against what was called careless talk. Basically, one example would be if, let's say, your husband wrote you a letter from a ship in the Pacific and he said where they were. Well, if you were talking on the phone to a friend of yours saying, hey, my husband is at such and such a place in the Pacific, people would say, hey, don't say that kind of stuff. Watch what you say. Don't say anything like that out loud. Tear up or burn letters that get sent to you after you read them. That way, no spies can overhear what you say or look into your letters or anything like that. So Americans were very cautious about foreign spies. Here's one of the more famous posters. Certainly, I would say a stereotypical racist poster there. A picture of a Japanese person that says, open trap, make happy Jap. Basically saying if you talk, then you'll make the Japanese happy because they'll hear our battle plans and thwart our efforts to win the war. All right, so careless talk was something that was warned about quite a bit. Okay, Americans said that Americans were very afraid that they would be overheard by foreign spies. Because remember, with the Japanese-American internment camps, that the big reason for that, at least so they said, was because Japanese Americans were seen as a national security threat because they might be spies. So basically, we said you can't be too careful. Just to be safe, don't say anything that you wouldn't want the Japanese to overhear. You had other posters encouraging Americans to buy what were called victory bonds, kind of like war bonds, donations, financial donations to support the war effort that would later on be paid back to you after the war, sometimes with interest. Okay, so in order to gain financial support for the war, that's why these posters were made. All right, so on the left there, you have this picture of a historic or a heroic soldier there saying, buy victory bonds, I'm doing my part, you should too. And then on the right, okay, you have a woman and a baby saying, keep these hands off, right? So really kind of tugging at your emotions there, saying, don't let the Nazis, okay, as you see this hand here, or the Japanese, okay, don't let their hands get on our women and children. In order to stop that, you got to win the war and buy victory bonds to do that, okay? So while all this was going on, we've alluded to this before, all Japanese American citizens were in internment camps all throughout the country. There's a picture of one of the internment camps on the bottom there. So you see kind of like a prison camp. There were fences to where they could not get out, and these were the quarters where they were kept. You see a group of them eating in kind of like a mess hall in the top picture there. Okay. Now, we've already made the distinction that these were not concentration camps by any means. The Japanese Americans were not tortured, were not starved, were not killed, okay? So it's certainly not on the same level of concentration camps at all, but at the same time, they were prisons. It was still wrong to put them in these places against their will. And there are several reasons why this was morally wrong. First off, it took thousands of people away from their homes, from their jobs, from their schools, from their churches. I mean, just think about your life right now. You're a couple years away from graduating high school. What would happen if all of a sudden you were taken away? You wouldn't be able to graduate high school. It would be tough for you to get a job in the future. Your entire life might have a wrench thrown in it because of that. Really, your life gets disrupted, kind of put on hold, and things might not go well for you afterwards. Okay, so you're just being stripped away from really the only life you knew. And a lot of people never recovered financially because of this. Okay? Imagine if you own a business and you're taken away from that. What's going to happen? Your business is going to go under. You're going to lose the business that you may have even built yourself. A lot of people missed out on opportunities like going to college or finishing high school. There's one true story, I actually made a movie about it, of a Japanese-American baseball player who had just graduated high school and was about to be drafted into the major leagues, but then he was taken to an internment camp and never got to play pro baseball. So a lot of opportunities were missed out on, not to mention all the mental suffering they went through, just being essentially imprisoned with your family and friends for something you didn't even do, right? These people did not plan Pearl Harbor. They were not complicit in what they did. They just kind of looked like the people who did, all right? And that's why they were put into these camps. Now, this also, in addition to being morally wrong, really hurt the war effort on the home front too, because every single one of those 112,000 Japanese Americans could have been helping out with the war effort somehow. All right, they could have been helping out on the home front by even things like saving bacon grease or working in factories or uh, all the multitude of ways you could help out on the home front. Or they could even have been fighting in the war that entire time. Now, in the 1960s, in order to try to kind of make amends for this injustice that the U.S. government did upon these Japanese American citizens, something called the redress movement occurred. And this was an effort from the younger generation of Japanese Americans to basically get an apology from the U.S. government regarding the internment of their parents and grandparents during World War II. So most of the people who were, marching and protesting during the redress movement, they themselves had not actually experienced the internment 20 years before, but their parents had, their grandparents had, people they knew had, and therefore their lives had been impacted by it as well. All right, so the redress movement was big, trying to get an apology from the American government about it. In fact, it was not until the 1970s, it wasn't until 1975 that the U.S. government finally admitted that what they did was wrong, actually called it wrong, and that was President Gerald Ford, who finally, 30 years later, said that the Japanese American internment was wrong. And it wasn't until 1988, with President Ronald Reagan, that something was actually done about it. Okay, so in 1988, President Reagan made amends by signing something called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And this gave $20,000 to all who lived through the internment. And you might say, well, $20,000, I mean, what does that matter? I mean, the years of their life were taken. Well, yeah, that's true, and you can never completely make amends. But giving a substantial sum of money to people who suffered this does help, because remember, those years that they lost in the internment camps, that hurt them a lot financially. Some of them lost businesses, lost opportunities. All right, so this, in addition to being a symbolic, kind, noble gesture, it also helped a lot of Japanese Americans out practically. Okay, and we're going to be watching the short speech that President Reagan gave when he signed this act, also a little bit later in class. All right, so now that we talked about the home front, let's go back to Europe. Okay, last time we left off with Europe, Hitler had just lost the Battle of Britain to Churchill, and then he turned to the Soviet Union. Remember, he and Stalin had made an agreement with each other that said we're not going to fight each other, because even though they hated each other, they were also scared of each other. So they didn't want to fight each other, but now Hitler has gotten more bold, more brazen, and he said, you know what, no one can stop me, not even mighty Russia. So on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler dissolved his alliance with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. Now, who could have thought that Hitler would have broken his promise, that you could actually not trust him when he said he was going to be your friend? But of course, never trust Hitler, and Stalin learned that lesson. All right, so he invaded the Soviet Union, and this was called Operation Barbarossa. Now, as you see on the map there, just huge chunk of Europe had fallen to Germany. Almost all of it, really, was at least under German influence. And Germany invaded the Soviet Union here, and actually, as you see, got pretty far into the country of Russia, several hundred miles in. So at first, the invasion was successful, but then a thing called winter happened. Yes, he did invade in the summer, but invasion takes a very long time, and before long, the winter had set in. And Stalin's troops, his winterized troops, who were very accustomed to Russia's winter weather, they took the advantage and halted Germany's advance. All right, so this is really what the Germans kind of looked like here. They did not have the equipment that they needed, the clothes they needed. Their blood was not thick like the Russian soldiers' blood was, because they were used to the cold, and they were halted. They could not advance any further because the winter set in. Now, remember the very first day of class, I said one of the reasons we learn history is so we don't repeat mistakes that people made before us, that we learn lessons the easy way instead of the hard way. Well, here Hitler learned this lesson the hard way: don't invade Russia in the winter. He could have learned it the easy way because Napoleon tried to do the exact same thing, and that was his downfall as well. So Hitler should have paid better attention in world history class in high school, but I guess he did not. Now, this led to the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point of World War II in the Eastern Theater, all right, so between Russia and Germany. And the Battle of Stalingrad was actually the bloodiest battle of all time. Bloodiest battle of all time. More people died in this one battle than in any other battle in the thousands of years of human violent history. Okay, so this took place from August of 1942 to February of 1943, a very lengthy battle. Most World War II battles were not this long because we didn't use trenches anymore. But basically, an entire city was enclosed upon, and both sides fought in this city for months. And after 5 months of brutal fighting, the Soviet Union was finally able to defeat the Nazis and begin to slowly push them back into Germany. All right, the Germans suffered 850,000 casualties, and the Russians suffered 1.2 million casualties. So 2 million people died in this one battle. Okay, that's more than die in most wars total. And here you have 2 million people die in a single battle. All right, the Russians did suffer more casualties, but in the end they won because they were able to push the Germans back. Now you can probably guess the reason why Hitler was so intent upon taking this city called Stalingrad is not really because it had any strategic importance, but because it was called Stalingrad. He wanted to take the city that bore the name of his arch rival. All right, it ended up being a mistake for him. The Soviets were able to push them back, and from that point on, the Germans continued to lose and lose ground, especially in the Eastern Theater. Okay, so Stalingrad, bloodiest battle of all time, turning point of the war in the East. Now, the Axis powers also invaded North Africa. Not only were the Axis powers taking over Asia and Europe, but they also, especially the Italians, invaded North Africa. And the person who led the Allied forces against the Italian forces in North Africa was General George S. Patton. We all know that name. He was in the video we watched. He was the one who put the machine gun on the car and really kind of invented the tank brigade. And it was under his leadership here now in World War II that the Allies were able to push the Axis powers out of North Africa, and then we were able to invade Italy. All right, so after a couple of years of very hard fighting, the invasion of Italy by Patton and the other Allied forces led to Benito Mussolini's surrender. Okay, so Italy surrendered to the Allies on September 3rd, 1943. Benito Mussolini and Fascist Italy surrendered here. Okay, so now one of the three major Axis powers are out of the running, one down, two to go. But the other two, Germany and Japan, would take a lot more time and a lot more blood to defeat. Another group of people I want to talk about are the Tuskegee Airmen, especially since this is Black History Month. The Tuskegee Airmen these were an African American division of pilots during World War II. Here's some pictures of them there. Now, the reason why I say it was a black division and not just partially black, partially white, whatever, is because the units were segregated. You had black divisions, you had white divisions, you had Hispanic divisions. Okay, they were all segregated because integration had not become the law of the land yet in America. All right, now this group was one of the most decorated and successful divisions of the Allied forces. They shot down hundreds of Axis planes and were very skilled in what they did. So definitely a good group to remember, especially every February. So after the war had been going on for a while, Italy is now out, but Hitler and the Japanese are still very formidable forces. Millions of people are dying, and the Allied powers say we need to find a different strategy. Hitler is not going to be defeated easily, and it might take even longer for Japan. So FDR, the U.S. president, and Winston Churchill, the British prime minister, they've been allies for quite some time, and they say, you know what, the best way to defeat Hitler and defeat Japan is to get Stalin's help. Okay, so they said even though Stalin is just as evil as Hitler, right now he's not as much of a threat to us, and Hitler is being more aggressive in his policies and wreaking more havoc on the rest of the world, more so than Stalin is. Therefore, we need to team up with Stalin in order to crush Hitler. So Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, they met in Tehran, Iran, at the Tehran Conference, and they agreed to work together to defeat Germany and Japan. Now, Stalin agreed to fight in the Pacific, and Churchill and FDR agreed to invade Western Europe. And the reason why Stalin insisted that the Americans and the British invade Western Europe, like in France, was to redirect Nazi troops away from the Russian front. That way, some pressure would come off of the Eastern Front, move towards the West, and basically divide Hitler's troops between the British and Americans and the Russians. That way, both sides could work in on the Germans from opposite sides. The supreme Allied commander of the forces in Europe was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Great man, one of my favorite presidents. After the war, he became the 34th President of the United States, but first, he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. Okay, and he was also the mastermind behind the D-Day invasion. You probably heard of D-Day. This was the Allied invasion of Europe. It was called Operation Overlord, and this was enacted on June 6, 1944. Okay, it became known as D-Day. Here is a famous picture of him kind of rallying the paratroopers before the day before this attack. This was a very important invasion. If we had failed this invasion, it's very possible we would have lost the war. So we needed to succeed here. We had tried other invasions of Nazi-occupied Europe before, and they had failed. This one had to succeed in order for us to defeat the Nazis. All right. So this is the map of the D-Day invasion here. The Allies invaded the beaches of Normandy, France. That's northern France, right here. This area called Normandy. All right. So we started off in Great Britain, and in planes and ships went to Normandy, France, which was occupied by the Nazis. Now, there were two phases, two waves really, of this attack. The first was the landing of the paratroopers, and that was followed by the storming of the beaches, it's called, all right? Now, the importance of the D-Day invasion was that U.S. and British troops were able to successfully gain a foothold in France, and from there, from right here, we were able to begin the march into Nazi-occupied Europe and chisel away at Hitler's empire 1 mile at a time. Okay, but we had to get this foothold first, and that crucial step came on D-Day. Okay, came with Operation Overlord. All right, so the first step I said was the paratroopers. A paratrooper is someone who jumps out of an airplane. A parachute deploys, they land, and then they start fighting. Okay, so just imagine the kind of courage, the kind of bravery that it would take to do that. So here's an actual picture from D-Day. You have the paratroopers about to jump out of their plane. Here they are jumping out of their planes, just thousands of them jumping out of their planes once the planes were over Normandy. And as you can imagine, as they were floating down, they were getting shot at. All right, some of them didn't survive, but once they landed, they take off the parachute, get their rifle, and start shooting. All right, and they really have no rest there. Okay, so they tried to, and a lot of them succeeded in destroying a lot of the Nazi tanks, kind of attacking them from behind while they were shooting at these guys. Okay, because the second wave was when the Allied forces landed by boat on the beaches of Normandy, ran up on to the beaches, as you see here, and were met with fire, Nazi fire. Okay, but eventually, throughout the course of this day, the Allied forces were able to secure the beachhead. They were able to defeat the Nazis here and push them back and gain a foothold right here in formerly Nazi-occupied Europe. Right, and then from there, started marching inward towards Germany. So D-Day was not the end of the war, but it was certainly the turning point of the war in the Western theater. All right, and after this successful invasion of Europe, they still had a lot of work to do. They had to continue to push Germany back until they finally surrendered. Okay? And it took about 11 months to do this before the Germans finally surrendered. It took them about 11 months from D-Day until the end of the war. And during that time, you have them pushing into Europe. You have several large battles, for example, the Battle of the Bulge. You have Bastogne right here, okay, and that's when Patton and his tank brigade came in and kind of rescued some of the American soldiers who were kind of trapped there, and eventually were able to push into Germany itself. So while the British and the Americans and the Canadians are doing this on this side here, in France and Belgium, the Netherlands, and pushing into Germany from this end, on the other side, the Soviet Union is pushing in on them from the east. Okay, so Germany is shrinking and shrinking miles every single day towards the end there. Okay, so as they continue to push back from the east at the same time that we push back from the west, eventually, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler realized that he was completely defeated and could not win. He had vowed, after the German defeat in World War I, he had vowed never again to live to see another German surrender. So instead of surrender, He took a poison pill, a cyanide tablet, and then took a pistol and shot himself in the head. Okay, he committed suicide, and the defeated Nazi Germany, they surrendered on May 8th, 1945, just about a week after Hitler committed suicide. And this day, May 8th, 1945, this is called VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe. Okay, so now not only is Italy defeated, but Germany is finally defeated and Hitler is dead. There's a glorious day now that the war is over in Europe. Okay, so you have these newspaper articles, VE Day here. People are extremely excited about the unconditional surrender of the Nazis to the Allied powers. You have people celebrating in the streets, especially in the streets of formerly occupied territory that had formerly been occupied by the Nazis, like France, and it was just a really, really happy day for people. Now, of course, for England and for France and for most of Europe, this is the end of the war. But for America, it's not. Okay, we still have Japan. We still have to defeat the Japanese. All right, and we will talk about how we did that next class. All right, so if you have any questions or want me to re-explain anything a little bit better, let me know.